So we're back today. Well, again, we just finished up with Nick, and then he had to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talking about male responsibility and the whole issue of Charlie Sheen. We're going to be talking about the broken cord. You guys have been reading that, right?
Yeah.
Like a little book club?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What'd you think?
It was very eye-opening. I thought it was interesting to read it from that time period because it was before they knew really that FAS was a really big issue, and now people are aware of it, but I don't think people are as aware as they should be, and no one's really taking any action about it. But then in the book you see that they struggle even more back then, like when he sees doctors or like when he goes to get tested to be in school and stuff, and everyone's just like, he is mentally disabled, he has a very low IQ, what could it be? And I think that a very big struggle with that is that he was adopted, so they don't know his family history. Well, they do find out, but like he doesn't know to the full extent his family history and everything. Like in the beginning when he was in the hospital, when he was having all those seizures, and they say that like one of the most important things in when you want to diagnose someone is the family history, but since his parents aren't around and he wasn't in contact with his parents, they didn't know it to the full extent.
And you know, this is one thing that today we're seeing more commonly in children who are adopted from Russia and the Ukraine and Bulgaria, you know, a bunch of the Eastern Bloc countries, that we have no idea what their maternal history is, but we see a lot of the features of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. You know, many of them do have the facial features and many don't. Only about 15 to 20% of any population of kids are going to have it, because you have to have that exposure early on. But you're right, even with adoptions from Russia and Ukraine for a long time, parents had no idea that their children might have that, the adoptive parents. And you know, even if they had asked the adoption agency or the officials over in Russia or those countries, was there any prenatal exposure? You know, of course, there's going to be limited information given, right? And now there's a halt on adoptions from Russia. You guys knew that, right? And why do you think that is?
I think it's because in the Eastern European countries and how we see in the book, like Native Americans, drinking is so cultural that it's just such a common thing that everyone is always drinking, and you don't really think anything of it, like they don't really see it as wrong, and
It becomes socially acceptable.
yeah, it's socially acceptable.
Yeah, they said that the people who are pregnant or even have little babies bring them to the bars and they'll just drink and no one says anything about it.
Or they even put wine or beer into the baby's bottle. That's
Yeah.
what I read in the book.
Yeah, I worked with the Navajo community in New Mexico and Arizona while I was in medical school, and that was very commonly known there, that families would do that to help the baby sleep, is they would put alcohol into the baby's bottle. And you know, I did a lot of outreach and advocacy in a preconceptional health manner to teach young women, and actually did a train the trainer model with lay health advisors who are already working with the women to teach them, hey, let's not do this. But just like in the last segment on male responsibility, it's going to take a village. It takes the man and the woman and the grandparents and the aunts and the uncles to change this, to just say, look, if you cannot stop drinking on your own, we will give you support. We will help you. We will help you find resources that you need, and you don't need to feel guilty about what's already happened. Let's just stop at the moment. At whatever point you find out you're pregnant. So the book itself, what did it touch in you? Anything? I mean, Sarah, how did it speak to you?
I read it, and when I read the part written by Adam, I cried. I thought it was so sad, just because like we've talked about it so much, and to really hear someone's story about it, make it so personal of how this child's grown up and he's had all these issues, and it took so long to figure it out. I thought it was so sad, and reading about how he had all these issues and the doctors were trying to stop the seizures and the, you know, the psychologists were trying to help him in school and with his development, you know, and to not really work together to find like a common cause behind that, to me nowadays like seems so silly because, you know, taking all these psych classes, you know, the overall development of someone, you know, it's connected, and to have not looked for like that connection back then, it seems so silly to me today.
Yeah. Something that stuck out to me a lot was the fact of, in the beginning, he was in such denial that there was anything wrong with his son. He kept saying there has to be, he's just slow in development because he got a late start. There has to be an explanation. We're going to blame it on the medicine, everything. Like, if he can't count to 5, then he must excel in music or poetry. And I don't really blame him for that he's in denial. I think it's just the fact that he wasn't really aware of the issue. Like, he didn't know that what it could have possibly been, that like that Adam's brain had been so severely destroyed and affected by his birth mother drinking so much. And we find out that she died when she was 30.
Right, and
Yeah,
that's
from
so
alcohol poisoning.
very commonly
Yeah.
seen in the cases that I see of people on death row, where I go and evaluate them for, you know, this condition. Very often you see the mothers have died of cirrhosis, or they've died of alcohol poisoning, or they've died because they were, you know, asleep. You know, they had gotten drunk and, you know, kind of passed out in the cold and froze to death. One of my patients here, and in fact she wrote about it, Katerina, that's not her real name, but she wrote on our blog, described her situation where her mother had passed out while smoking a cigarette and burned their house down in Russia. And the dad had them out at a park playing, her and her brother, and when they got home the house was on fire, the mother was dead. And they had to then become homeless. They were living on the streets, and so the dad had to put them in an orphanage. And you know, these are very terrible social circumstances and situations caused by our social drug of choice. And I know that, you know, that term really spoke to you, Juliana. Social drug of choice, right?
Yeah, because it's just like, why do you have to have a social drug of choice? And it's so multi-generational. If there's an alcohol problem, in the end of the book when Adam turns 21 and he's like, the guys say that I'm old enough to drink, and Michael Doris is trying to explain to him, Adam, no you can't, you know what happened to your mom, you know what happened to your dad, I know that you want to be able to be like everyone else and fit in, but you just can't go down that road, like you just can't.
Well, you know, I tell kids in my practice, if anybody asks you, you want a beer? Say, no man, I'm fine. I've already had enough. All right, you've had enough in the 9 months you were in your mom's womb for 10 people for 10 lifetimes. It's not a lie when you say you've had enough. All right, you've had enough already. If you put alcohol on top of the injury that your brain already has, big problem. I mean, if even the average person is going to be diminished in their capacity under the influence, someone with brain damage prenatally induced is going to be even worse.
Yeah.
And you know, I do tell kids in my practice, you know, as they're diagnosed, and some of them come to me already diagnosed by a geneticist or a dysmorphologist. Some of them come to me by referral from Children's National Medical Center, Department of Psychiatry. And by the time, you know, I've worked with them, you know, for a number of years, or some of them, if they're already 12 or 13, I go ahead around that time and explain to them what their condition is. And there are books that are written about this that are appropriate for children. And I let them read them. Because, you know, honestly, knowing that they're not stupid, you know, that they're bright in many ways, just like Adam. You know, he had a brightness about him. He was severely, severely affected, though.
Yeah.
And there is a range. But, you know, teaching them based on their strengths and not focusing so much on their differences and their deficiencies. And, you know, maybe they won't grow up and be a rocket scientist, right? Or, you know, but maybe they could go to college for art.
Right, and they can have
Or
a happy
music,
life.
and have a happy life, a very happy
Yeah.
life, and productive, and feel
Yeah.
good about themselves.
And they shouldn't have the adults around them say, "Oh, you can't come to my school because we don't have the resources to work with your deficiency or something." Like that's
Right.
no. You should focus on what they can do and enhance that, and not, I guess, make the child feel bad of the things that they can't do.
Yeah. Because they just want to fit in and be accepted and just be like everyone else and not have to think about how they're different. And I think that's why it's a problem when people say to them, like, you're old enough to drink, you should drink, because they're easily influenced by others and they want to just be accepted by them. But they don't realize that there's already been so much damage done that more alcohol is going to severely affect it too.
It's going to make it even worse.
Makes you stronger of a person to deny that,
Yeah.
to deny drinking.
It helps you
It
grow.
does. Yeah. To do it the first time and understand that you can still socialize with somebody. Have you guys, I'm sure you have, gone to a party and you didn't drink? So like maybe people would say, "Oh, you're 21, you can drink." And you're like, "Man, I know that, you know."
Right.
But I just don't care to.
Yeah.
It's easy for say us to be able to say that, right? How do you think it would be for somebody who has FASD? Daniela, you know
Almost
some
impossible.
children. Yeah.
Because they try everything to have friends, to fit in. Like we had a situation like 1 or 2 days ago where they were trying to buy their friends their tickets to the carnival to just be able to go with friends. So they really try everything to fit in, have friends, make people like them. They're so gullible. Like,
They're very gullible, and if there's a book written by a colleague of mine, Dr. Stephen Greenspan, and it's The Annals of Gullibility. It's I love that book, and he is hilarious. He's the most dry but witty person you'll ever hear present, and you can't possibly fall asleep when he's talking, even though it's very monotone. But he's helped write the intellectual disability criteria for even DSM-5, and we now have gullibility in DSM-5 as one of the criteria for, believe it or not, intellectual disability. I'd like us to look at those criteria at some point, you know, during our sessions, because, and not to you know, move too far past the broken cord. Adam himself was probably, I'm going to say, moderately to severely what used to be called MR, you know, mental retardation. With the new DSM-5, the way that they've set it up is no longer under MR. It's called intellectual disability. And in the past, we used numbers, right, to determine if somebody was intellectually disabled, basically, right? So if your IQ was anywhere between, say, 60 and 70, or say, you know, even above 70 to somewhere between 70 to 80, what did we call that? Anybody know? Borderline intellectual functioning. That means they weren't considered mentally retarded. We don't use that term anymore. It's actually intellectually disabled, right? With the new criteria, they're looking at adaptive functioning. So can they, you know, balance a checkbook? Can they learn to take public transportation? Can they drive a car? Can they, you know, make a nutritious meal for themselves? Can they have relationships with typically developing peers? That means, you know, peers that are not intellectually disabled. And to what degree are they affected in 3 domains? It's essentially conceptual, which is like cognitive. There's, and it's not really based on numbers, it's social, and then it's practical, which is like activities of daily living. And for Adam in the book, he would have been down at probably the severe level on adaptive functioning, all right? Whereas in the previous, he would have been maybe mild to moderate, or actually moderate to severe. He would, probably moderate. Now, these days, all the kids that used to be in the mild or the borderline intellectual functioning would now fall, based on adaptive functioning, a lot of them, into mild intellectual disability. Now, let's take a kid like Adam or any of the others. What would that mean for them in our highly technological society?
They can't adapt to how technology is changing. Like, everything is constantly changing, and there are so many new things. Like, the iPhone can do literally anything, and it's not that hard to figure out, but for someone who's not used to it, for someone who sees that as such a big change, that is very difficult to figure out.
But they would be able to figure out maybe the iPhone, but what about figuring out how to adapt and grow within, say, a tech community, within the tech industry? Like, I'm talking about more vocational, so how would someone with this condition be able to get a job and to maintain a job in today's workforce, being so technologically driven? Like, you have to be able to, do multiple things within your job. It's not just like it used to be, right?
Well,
It's very hard for them.
They need a lot of structure, a lot of
Yeah.
like help at first, so they can kind of remember what they have to do, and as soon as they get into the structure, they can do a job, but they have a hard time doing several things and switching like
Yeah.
work.
And we see with Adam how he's working at Red Robin, and he was he had the dishwashing job, and he even got laid off from that.
Yeah, there was one boy that I've recently seen here in Maryland. He had a job at a restaurant and could never remember the menu to be a waiter, so he was just bussing tables, okay? So these are usually individuals who do okay in a low-wage job, okay? But with the economy being what it is, can you really afford to pay your bills on a low-wage job? And what if you, with public transportation, the way that they view things, if the bus is late 5 minutes and you expect it to be there 8 o'clock and it's 8:05, typically they go back in the house and say the bus isn't coming.
Yeah, it throws off their schedule and their ritual and everything, which is what they go by. They just go by routine because it's all they can just program into their memory.
If they have programmed it into their memory. But so many do not have the family structure to be able to do that. This, Adam was raised by a PhD level person who fought for every single service he got, and he literally had to scratch and fight and fist fight people, right, to get the services he needed for his child. How many people in America do you think can do that for their children? Not many. Like, we live in an area where people can and do, but middle America, no way. They don't even know they should.
Yeah, a lot of people just don't have the resources.
Right.
And they might not even have the diagnosis yet. They might
Yeah.
know, okay, they have a hard time focusing or keeping a job, but they don't have a name for it because it's not that popular.
It's not that well known, and maybe the mom herself drank before she knew she was pregnant, stopped drinking, and it's not even in her own consciousness that this could be a condition that her child is suffering from. Adam's mother drank heavily, I mean, to the point of blacking out in the pregnancies, they found out, right? And by the time she was 30, she had died of alcohol-related illness. For a woman who's, a so-called social drinker, but her drink of choice is the Long Island iced tea or some other, fancy drink that has a lot of alcohol in it, it could just be 1 or 2 drinks during somebody's wedding that leads to this. So, Michael Doris, though, did do a lot for this issue. He helped establish the National Organization on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome. He lobbied and advocated for reforms in labeling on alcohol. He wrote to the National Science Foundation, as you read in the book, to figure out what was going on with his son, but then to kind of raise awareness about this. From a policy point of view, like how would you say we should change things based on what you've read now with the book and the problems that Michael Doris faced with Adam?
First of all, I think it should be illegal to let a pregnant woman drink. I think that is one of the biggest issues.
And you know, the tricky part, and they do say that in the book, the tricky part with that is, you know, we may end up with a lot of prisons filled with pregnant women, okay? Now let me just take a step back. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, they did studies in London jails. And they found that when they incarcerated women, their babies ended up way more healthy. When they incarcerated, just by chance, an alcoholic woman happened to be incarcerated for whatever reason, because they weren't doing it because she was pregnant. But there were doctors going around, believe it or not, into prisons looking at, you know, women who were incarcerated and what their births were compared with women who were not incarcerated. What do you think they found? They found better outcomes for the babies. So
They didn't have a drop of alcohol.
well, not necessarily a drop, because obviously they probably had been drinking at some point, you know, before, you know, like in other words, because, you know, hopefully the guards weren't getting them pregnant in the jail, if you know what I mean, you know, and they weren't having conjugal visits with their partners, you know, so these were women who were already coming in pregnant, right? So likely, and they were alcoholic women, so that means they did drink early on. But their outcomes for their babies were a little bit better, right? And there's a lot of evidence to support that, but it doesn't mean that we should incarcerate women. I believe we need to preconceptionally educate women to be contracepting, right? Because if we incarcerate pregnant women, what's going to happen is that they're not going to admit, they're going to start drinking under the table, right? And the family's going to collude with them, because that's what families do. And they're going to enable the behavior, and they're going to just be, you know, sneaking it to them, okay, without anybody knowing it. I think we need to do more education, quite frankly, and we need to help women get into treatment before they get pregnant. But all the systems of care these days are set up to treat pregnant women, mostly, not preconceptional women. It's very hard to get into a treatment program if you're not pregnant. If you are pregnant, you're top on the list. But guess what? Average stage in pregnancy that pregnant women get in to treatment, 4 to 5 months pregnant. So what is the point? What is the point? No offense. We want to help the babies.
But there's so much damage already done.
And a program I worked in Robeson County, North Carolina, which is a very rural area, we had, you know, we actually ended up developing transitional housing for women to live, because we asked them, it'd be a woman kind of like Adam's mom, right? The women were having multiple babies, one after another, which I understand his mom, by the time she was like 20, had already had, wasn't it 5 births? It was like 5, and then she had some either miscarriages or a couple of abortions. I think it was something like that. So we actually asked the women coming into the halfway house, the pregnant women who were coming in on average at 4 to 5 months pregnancy, why do you keep coming back 2 years later, having another baby? What do you think they told us? Because the government keeps taking them away from me. So what we did is we said, oh, you want to raise your own babies? We'll show you how. We built a $1.8 million transitional housing community for women. It's still there. It's called Grace Court. We established a 501c3, a lot like what I'm attempting to do now with the foundation. And then we built the transitional housing facility. They can live for up to 2 years after they leave the halfway house with their baby. The courts will reunite them with their children who have been fostered out. That solves the foster care problem, right? The foster care problems is a shambles.
Yeah.
Have you guys heard much about that? I mean, this little boy was in a foster home, but in his biological home, apparently, I don't know, maybe even the foster home, he had been chained to the bed.
Yeah.
Did you guys read that?
Yeah.
Chained to the bed.
And they said how his brother was too old, so he was stuck in foster care, so you don't even know what ended up happening to him.
Right. Wow. And maybe this wasn't the story of the person whose family, whose mom had already had multiple children. But I know I have recently heard of a story where by age 20, actually I think it was a patient I recently saw, unfortunately. These are all unfortunate cases and they all began running together after a while, but I think it was one of my patients from Russia that I recently saw, whose mother had 5 children by the time she was 20, but very, very similar circumstances, but in Russia, right? This was a Native American village where he was born, but 5 children by the time she was 20, and all of them had some degree of effects and had been taken out of the home by the time the child I saw was very young.
We have the same thing in Germany too. When I worked as a social worker, there were so many cases where we took out a child and then the mom was pregnant again, or there were like 3 or 4 siblings, and the mom still wanted to have another child because, as you said, the kids get taken out and they still want to have a child.
And that, I think that also goes back to how we talked about male responsibility, because they talk about Adam's dad and how he was in and out of jail for certain things, but it all started with him being drunk.
You mean the situation of him being in jail was because he had been drinking?
Yeah, whether he had robbed someone or whatever, it all stemmed from him being drunk.
And you know, this is a multi-generational picture. You had talked about knowing some people in the community who, in our community, who you believe may have this condition now that you've kind of learned more about it. Used to, and this is why I went to medical school, used to, doctors would look at these children and they would say, they look pretty funny looking. And they'd look at the parents and they'd say, pretty funny looking too. It must be genetic. And do you know what they wrote on the chart? You know, Daniela, go ahead and write.
Pretty funny looking kid or funny
Yeah,
looking
funny looking kid, FLK. That phrase, and I've written a paper on it. It's called, it's in Psych News. We can look at it if you want to, but FAS, a preventable tragedy, is in Psych News from way back when I was a resident. I heard the term FLK, and that made me so angry, it sent me to medical school. That's exactly what, isn't that crazy that I would go to medical school because of hearing FLK? But I was like, you have got to be out of your mind. This rural pediatrician told me that, and he was just so kind, and he's Native American, Lumbee, and he was like, yeah, you know, we'd look at these kids and, you know, we'd write down FLK on the chart. There are still some pediatricians, my understanding is, that still use that term. There are still some geneticists and dysmorphologists who use that term. And it makes me mad. Does it make you mad?
I actually was talking about it with my brother. My brother's only 12, so I was trying to like tell him about what I was doing, and he was like, let me see someone who has it. And I Googled pictures and showed them to him, and he was like, I mean, they just look weird, but you don't really think there's anything wrong with them. They just like look funny.
Right, they look funny, right.
Yeah.
But you kind of get it as a gestalt, that they look different. Do you remember, I think it was last week, I shared with you guys the pictures of the psychiatrist from Cesare Lombroso, who's the father of criminology. He's a psychiatrist from Italy. He's also a medical anthropologist. But he went around looking at people in prisons, and he saw that a lot of them were funny looking, right? And he did facial measurements and autopsies and brain volume measurements and things like that, and you know, looked at their face, and there were people then drawing pictures of faces of people who were criminals because they believed that there was something there. And I mean, it was alcohol.
Yeah.
I mean, it was right in the freaking front of their face. Now, having said that, there's one other book besides The Broken Cord that I think is a, how do you say, it's one of those classics in FASD. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Anybody read it?
Mm-hmm.
You had to read it for school probably. They force-fed it to
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Sarah? No. Okay. Give me the gist. Do you remember? Test tube baby?
Yeah. They had basically a class of people, and they made babies as test tubes, and to purposely make a class, they would put alcohol in the test tube to
Lower their
lower their
lower
IQ,
their IQ.
like, make them not as highly functioning as the alphas or betas.
Uh-huh.
So
So it was,
the people who were alcohol impaired, they were the lower class.
right, alphas, betas, I think it was epsilons,
And
gammas, deltas,
Yeah.
right? I think there were 5 classes. The first 2 classes, believe it or not, they did not separate out the little cells. They would let them develop into their own being. But the lower class, which were the deltas and epsilons, they actually, once the babies had started forming, they would take out cells from one of them and keep on growing those cells. Like they would separate all of them to make essentially 1,000 twins. And then they would subject them in their little test tubes, like you were saying, to radiation, a little bit of radiation, and drops of alcohol. Do you know when this book was written? 1931. 1931.
Long time ago.
You would think
Not
that
only
they
a long
would
time.
have published something since then, like about the danger of alcohol for the fetus.
Okay, well, to be honest with you, that was at the time of prohibition in this country. And what happened was anything that was written in around prohibition time, pre-prohibition, it got labeled as highly moralistic. So after prohibition, after the repeal of prohibition, people said, you know what, all that public health information, because we had a lot of it prior to prohibition, they said, doesn't matter. It's highly moralistic. It's influenced by the temperance movement, all those women that got excited and upset that alcohol was causing deaths and babies being born deformed and things like that. That doesn't matter. They knew it. We have a lot of, if you attend any of my lectures, which Daniela has, and I don't know about Sarah, but you can see that I have posters that were done in the early 1900s. Some posters from Austria, posters from Sweden, posters from the U.S., public health posters, showing how babies died more frequently, how children were not as smart. They were more, imbeciles when, that's what they called them, when the mothers drank. Had a lot more health problems. So, although we're getting this book in 1989, which did change some things, we've had these warnings before.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, we've had these warnings and people know, it's just they choose to ignore it. And they choose to not really consider it a huge public issue. But I think that that's like one of the main issues for FAS, that people just don't see it as a huge public issue.
And yet, recently, a study by Phil May, he's a PhD working out of University of North Carolina system down in North Carolina. He used to be out at University of New Mexico. He recently came out with some data showing as many as 1 to 5% of children school age in this country have this condition, some degree of this condition. 1 to 5%. We already knew it was 1%, which is as frequent an incidence or prevalence as autism. It's as prevalent as autism. It's sometimes misunderstood as autism. There was a study that came out last year from England showing that a high prevalence of kids in an autism clinic actually had the diagnosis. If you went back and tried, looked at the prenatal history and you looked at the features, had the diagnosis of FASD. And what is it now? After 15 years, people in the autism community have come out of the closet and are trying to teach us about this. People in the FASD community need to get out of the closet and start teaching about it, right?
There's a whole movement.
Yeah.
We got to have a
There's
movement.
a lot of activity going on, at least in this area.
A lot.
Walks, runs, fundraisers, all raising awareness and raising money for autism.
Well, we're going to do that, ladies. We're going to hold hands and we're going to do that for FASD, and you are my girls, okay? You got to get that. You are the change agents, okay? We're agents of change, just like the Girl Scouts have a whole journey on that now. You are the change agents. If you consider what Rachel Carson did, Rachel Carson, anybody know who Silent Spring? All right, well, thankfully, we don't have the pesticides and chemicals in our environment because Rachel Carson, who actually lived in Silver Spring, Maryland, and worked for the Department of Fisheries, was a PhD, and she wrote about what chemicals are doing to the environment and how if we weren't careful, we would have a silent spring because it was affecting bird eggs. And I'm sure you've heard about the environmental movement of the 60s. A lot of that was spawned because Rachel Carson wrote her book. And she subsequently died like 2 years after it was published, but she did a lot of public speaking in that 2 years, and ironically, she died of breast cancer. But, you know, I believe that what she did for environmental chemicals, we need to band together and begin teaching people about alcohol and what it's doing to babies even before we find out we're pregnant. And Michael Doris felt so vehement about it that he wanted to make some changes, and he did through his book.
Yeah.
I read the book in 1993, you know, a few years after it was published, and I left my job in pharmaceutical research. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and first of all, they thought I would get educated beyond my intelligence going to college. So it was not looked on in good favor. But then I got a job, which was really great because I didn't think that would happen. And so leaving that job 4.5 years later, because I read this book and I wanted to go back to school, you know, kind of everyone in my family was like, what are you doing? But I did it. And then after doing my master's in public health and, you know, doing a lot of promotion and awareness about this issue from a preconceptional health point of view, I went to a rural area, and that's where I developed Grace Court, and decided, you know, hearing that term, funny looking kid, that, well, I guess I better pack my bags and go to medical school. And that I did. And each one of you has that power in you. Each one of you have been given gifts, and you're very bright. And this may not be your cause. It doesn't have to be, but it can be, because there's not enough of us out there.
Yeah, we can take his movement and just start our own, branch off of that.
Pretty creative.
Yeah,
That's
recreate
right.
it in this generation where we now have more resources than he did back then and everything, and now we have a better understanding than he did. He created this movement, but he didn't really have that much knowledge on it before because it wasn't really a known issue. But we know about it, and we know so many cases of it, so we can recreate that movement.
Right. And bring awareness to it, right?
Right.
And I think for people like Daniela, who has, you know, seen it firsthand, right? I mean, I'm sure that you would have many, many things that you could say and to help people understand.
Right, and it makes me sad, but now thinking back, I have this one case always from Germany in my mind where the boy shows almost all the same symptoms as Adam in the book. Like, he hated taking showers. It was always a screaming battle getting him in the shower. We could get him toilet trained. He was 5 when he came to live in our facility. And, like, it makes me mad that nobody really could, like, nobody could figure out what was wrong with him. I don't know if they figured it out by now, but never, like, didn't come up that he might have been prenatally exposed to alcohol.
Well, you know, that's a very good point. Showers, okay? Showers, light touch, right? Sensory issues.
Right.
He had it. Adam had it. Your boy had it. Mary Green is an author. She lives in this area now. She's written a book about her son, and he was adopted from Russia. He couldn't speak when he came here. Like, he wasn't even speaking in his native language. The first words he said to her in English were, "Mommy, why does rain hurt? Why does rain hurt?" Her book is called When Rain Hurts. Can I challenge each of you, once you finish this, and I would want you to finish reading this one, because I am not one to like read half of a book and put it down. Okay, you got to finish it and be done with it. And if it takes you 2 years, which I know you're all right, you should be done with it this week. Okay. When Rain Hurts by Mary Green. We're going to read that one, not for next week because I don't want to force feed you. We're going to do something else next week. But can you read Mary Green's When Rain Hurts? I'm going to read it myself because, you know, she lives here. We could get her to come. Hey, would that be great or what?
Yeah. And she
Would that
probably
be
would
awesome?
love to come.
You know, she would love to come. I know she would. I could get her to come. So we're going to get her to come. Now, on June 25th, we are going to Falls Church, Virginia. There's another book that Diane Malbin has written, and there's a center called Families Affected by Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, and they go around and they do trainings all over the country based on Diane Malbin's work. And her philosophy is that this is a brain-based condition. I believe that for 21 years. It's not about the face, not about what the face looks like. We're not going to get plastic surgery for these kids' faces most of the
It's not
time.
going to change anything.
Unless they have a cleft lip or palate, we're not going to do much to change the face. Or if they have strabismus, right, where the eye is like, you know, it's a lazy eye, which sometimes does happen. They could get some work on that. And that would actually help them functionally, not to have a cleft or, you know, strabismus. But generally speaking, we don't treat the face. But the face is a biomarker of what?
Yeah. Because a lot of people think like they don't have the face and there's nothing wrong with them, but that's not always the case. There could be something severely wrong with them.
It's just a short period of time during the pregnancy where the facial features are developing.
Yeah.
Like, they could be having functional issues instead of necessarily like appearance issues.
Yeah. And the fact that you guys are gaining this insight, I'm going to take you to the FASD training. It's mostly going to be families that are there, and you will probably be on the verge of tears. And I'm not trying to desensitize you to this issue to where you don't tear up, because I have, and I still continue to, okay? What I want to do is to enlighten you and to educate you so that you can go on and start a revolution.
I love that.
We're doing it. Okay. Well, next week we're going to, I think, Juliana, you're in charge, right, of pulling together, and we're going to do a topic on criminal justice, right?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Well, I guess that's it for today. What do you think?
Yeah.
Bye. Bye.